Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. It's that time again. It's midweek, and I want you to play some Magic so that you can win 2 free rare or better ICRs. This week's midweek Magic is going to be a shakeup of historic proportions. That's right, it's historic shakeup. And guess what? The fine folks at Arena were smart enough to tell us what the shakeup list was ahead of time. So maybe this event will actually have a purpose. Stay tuned. We got all the details for you. But before we get into all that, my crack research team has recently pointed out that we are the only channel doing consistent and timely midweek Magic content. And by crack team, of course, I mean one comment from someone who had nothing at all to do with this monkey image. So be sure to subscribe right here at the Planeswalker Stronghold for all of your future midweek Magic needs, because we will be bringing you a deck list or strategy every single week. Now, what were we talking about this week? Oh, yeah, right. Now, I do have to give it someone credit at Arena/Wizards, because this list really does make a lot of good sense and asks a lot of good questions about the format. For instance, Archmage's Charm is probably the first Alchemy release card that we've thought about maybe changing from the perspective of historic. Cauldron Familiar is part of the deck that's king of the hill right now. Golgari Sacrifice is just absolutely tremendous. It's hard to build a green deck in Historic without using Collective Company. Things like Divine Purge and Esper Sentinel are all over the place in white decks. Expressive Iteration just got banned in like every other format known to Magic. I mean, shoot, the 2 kids that live down the street even banned it. It's pretty crazy. Gito Lavamancer is definitely doing some sort of gut check on red deck wins. Greasefang is kind of a combo deck, and while it's not a top contender, it does have some potential. Heliod is another one of those gut checks at the Life Gain Matters. Land of War Elves is very clearly an attack at the Elves mono green deck. Lotus Field is one that kind of strikes me a bit funny because, I mean, isn't Lotus Field one of the decks that we're very strongly thinking is going to be early Pioneer here in Explorer? So why are they thinking about banning or changing that card? I'm not sure I get it. Loris is all over the place. Mizzix's Mastery, I gotta be honest, that's a card, I don't even know what it is. Muxus, on the other hand, everybody knows he's our favorite goblin. Niv Mizzet is my personal favorite. Is it Dragon? And although I don't play the Reborn version, it is definitely the hinge point of a very significant deck right now. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is all about that blue-white control, and of course, why would you even play a black deck in Historic if you're not playing Thoughtseize? So how did the fine folks at Arena/Wizards come up with such a well thought out potential ban list? Well, they looked at all the top decks for recent historic events and they banned a card from all of the top 12 decks. That's right, we had to go all the way to deck number 13 before we could find a deck list that was not affected by this. And really, that version of Red Deck Wins very easily could have been running the Gitu Lavamancer. It just didn't. Mostly, that's a statement about Red Deck Wins resilience rather than any statement about one particular card. In fact, when I pulled data from the most prevalent 23 decks in recent historic events, I only found 4 deck lists out of 23 that weren't affected by something in this shakeup list. And we're going to take a minute and talk about all of them. I would like to start with Boris Feather. And while it's not affected by this shakeup list, I want to warn people about that deck list. It is very dependent on the signature card Feather. And in fact, you really need 3 and more likely 4 copies on that. And unfortunately, that's a card that's not really played anywhere outside of this signature deck. Now, it does make for a very interesting twist on a Boros aggro deck. It's not your same old go wide strategy. It's not boring mono red, just swing all the time. And it gives a little bit of a combo tricksy feel to it, which might have appeal for a certain player base, but just know it's maybe not the most budget-friendly alternative. And unfortunately, I have to say the same thing with the mono blue artifacts deck, because a lot of the cards you need for this deck, again, just aren't going to be used anywhere else. This deck does have the redeeming quality that it's somewhat speculative. We know that the upcoming Dominaria United, as well as its next set, the Brothers War, are both very likely to be artifact centric. So all of these cards may go up in both utility and empirical value for your collection. So if you really like mono blue artifacts, or you're willing to roll the dice on a little speculation, that might be a deck list to consider. And my plan is to put both the links down in the doobly-doo. So if you're looking for those decks, just click on over and grab them up. Next up, I want to talk about Red Deck Wins. And this is one of those decks that you will probably almost never have regret having invested in, because this deck really changes only at glacial speed. So once you invest in the cards, they're probably going to stay relevant in some version of Red Deck Wins, basically forever. This deck does tend to be a little less budget friendly because it's so simple that a lot of times you're much more dependent on rares and mythics. Uncommon versions of Red Deck Wins tend to be a little less prevalent, and let's face it, even in historic, uncommon and common wildcards are still at a premium. This deck also tends to be a little less budget friendly because the current standard environment has not had a big impact on the technology that's presented. In other words, almost everything in this is not available through standard play and building your standard collection. One other reason for that is Red Deck Wins tends to be the old reliable deck, and everyone goes back to playing it right after something like rotation or a big banning that affects it or affects the meta in historic. So the only time you really see new technology introduced is, well, really around rotation, which is right around the corner. So investing in this deck, you might see 1 or even 2 of those cards kind of come out of the latest technology and not be used quite as much. But on the upside, even an older version than the latest technology of red deck wins is still pretty darn good. And if you've been keeping track, that brings us to a green-white Enchantress, a deck that is both a historic staple and, well, really kind of been around since Magic very first started. It is also somewhat more budget friendly because Enchantress is a fairly supported concept in the current standard environment. Now, unfortunately, the traditional historic list that you're looking at doesn't really reflect that. And I've left the numbers in here for my own personal shortcomings on this deck. And I think the rares and mythics came to somewhere around 40 wild cards. And since I've been grinding Arena as a budget player since the very beginning, I am pretty much finishing out my 5th standard season on Arena. If I'm 40 wild cards short, I can only imagine how daunting of a number that may be for someone who is a much more of a recent addition to Arena. But the good news is I think we can budget up this list a little bit and make it much more accessible for newer players. All right, so having taken the historic list that we just looked at, as well as one of the predominant on-theme alchemy lists, this is what I boiled down to. And right off the bat, please notice there's 68 cards in this list, not because I think you should run the list exactly as presented, but I wanted to leave some room in the list in case there were cards you didn't have or wild cards you didn't want to spend or couldn't spend for at the moment. That way you still had a rough idea of something that you could build here without necessarily having to lay out resources that you didn't have or didn't want to spend. Now, with that in mind, let's start with some of the wild cards that may be worth consideration. And first and foremost, be aware I have already made all of my official wildcard recommendations for this year. So everything that's here is a little bit extra and certainly something that you might want to take with a grain of salt and may not be worthwhile unless you're really interested in this type of deck. And when in that situation, I tend to structure my wildcard recommendations around having opened the vault. So 1 mythic, 2 rares, and 3 uncommons. And where I'm going to start today is with the mythic. That is History of Benalia. This is one of the early Saga enchantments, so it fits just really, really well with Enchantress. And the fact that it has a significant board state by creating night tokens made this an all-star when it was in standard, and is definitely one of the best ways you could spend a mythic to support this deck. Moving on into the rares, Authority of the Consuls. Creatures your opponent control enter the battlefield tapped. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your opponent's control, gain 1 life. So obviously this is an enchantment and it's very easy to cast at just 1 white mana. But also this is one of those cards to very strongly consider if you want to get more serious and competitive in both historic and the Explorer formats. This deck is significant potentially in both of those formats, and this is a one-of card that you need for either versions there. It also shows up in several other white lists, although not always just as a one-of. Some of the other rares that I would suggest to consider. Where did it go? Of course, the namesake card of the deck, Enchantress Presence. 1 rare, you really need at least 1 copy of this, and obviously 2, 3, maybe even 4, depending upon the list, would really be ideal. And honestly, if you're not willing to lay out at least 1 rare wild card on this particular card, this may not be the list for you in Historic. It might be that Red Deck Wins is more your speed, and hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, when it comes to uncommons here, certainly you might want to spend a wild card on Kami of Bamboo Groves if you haven't already collected a playset on that by purchasing packs. I certainly think that is the more budget conscious way to add this to your collection. The other thing that you're going to want to consider is the uncommon Destiny Spinner. Creatures and enchantment spells you control cannot be countered, so obviously this is a very good silver bullet card for this deck. And in fact, you might even want to run 2 copies here if you already have your Kami of the Bamboo Groves. The more you have of this, the more solid this deck becomes. The other and last uncommon I would give serious consideration to is Gauntlets of Light. It is an aura, so you do potentially open yourself up to being 2 for 1. But in addition to giving the creature +0/+2, and it assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, and for a total of 3 mana, you can untap this creature, so it can always be on offense and hitting even harder because of that +0/+2. So very, very strong, but I don't know that I'd go more than 1 of these, particularly in an early build of the deck. Now, you will probably notice some other things going on here in the list, one of which is the selections of Blossoming Sands. I think this is a very accessible piece of mana fixing for this deck, and the life gain is also very good. Most of you are going to have access to the Kamigawa versions of this, but I did also list a couple of the others, frankly, because that's what I have, and you should be aware of cards like this that have multiple prints. If you're downloading the list, don't just spend a bunch of wild cards, because you might already have these in another form. From there, the mana base is pretty simple. I would probably cut plains here, all else being equal, just to get to that 23 land point. We also talked about Fable Passage this year as a very solid wild card. In fact, I said this would be the only rare land wild card I would recommend for the year, and I believe that has held true. The main reason for that is this is the rare mana fixing wild card that fits in any deck that you build, because it can go fetch any basic land that you need, i.e. it doesn't matter what colors you're running whatsoever. From there, what else are we looking at? We had an uncommon All That Glitters. We built around this earlier in the year for Historic, and obviously this is a really good card for a deck like this. I think we added this in the Shrines version of Enchantress that we built earlier in the season. We talked about Destiny Spinner. Most of these other cards you should have available in your collection. Wedding Announcement, I included this because obviously it fits the theme, but it is also one of the early contenders for being in next year's new player experience, which makes it a little more accessible depending upon when you're watching this video. Also, Faceless Agent was one of the commons that I recommended this year as a wild card, because it fits so nicely into any tribal deck. In this, it very easily goes and grabs a spirit, or I think a human, are your 2 most prevalent creature types out there. Last wild card that we use this year that kind of fits this deck is Guardian Project. For 4 mana and enchantment, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or creature card in your graveyard, you get to draw a card. And at the time, I recommended this because of its value in Brawl, but also as budget players, a lot of times we only have 1 copy of our key cards. So being able to get added value out of that by being able to draw a card each time we play it is just absolute beast mode budget. So still very strongly recommending that. And if you notice, a lot of those recommendations for wildcard that we made throughout the year continue to fit into new decks, even though it's not the reason we originally made the recommendation. We always try and stay to a very generic, well thought out cards. Now, most of the other things here, ranging from Paladin class, Portable Hole, Commune with Spirits, and all the way up to Hallowed Fountain, all come to you from your standard play and building that standard card base. Again, there's more cards in the list, so if you didn't happen to get a Mythic Hallowed Fountain, I wouldn't necessarily go spend a wild card on it, because you still have a whole nother year to maybe get that in a pack, or well, it probably won't be in a jump-in list, but it could. Of course, ICRs are also a thing, so you have a lot of opportunity to get this. Don't rush into it with a wild card. I do think there's room in this list for a copy of Field of Ruin. It's been printed several times over the last year or two, so it's very easy for you to have this. I would not run more than one copy here. So that's the basic of the list. Remember, this is a starting point. If you download the list, don't just hit the craft all button. Give some thought, play with the list a little bit, and make it your own, because I can make a list for general consciousness, but I can't make a list specifically for your collection. I need you to do that part. Now, I think that looks like a fun list, and one that'll make some headway in this event and help you get your free ICRs and or cosmetic very easily. And in fact, I feel so strongly about it. If this deck gets just 10 likes today, I will play it live at 8 p.m. on Twitch. So be sure to smash the like button, because, well, I'm willing to whore myself out for just 10 likes. What do you got to lose? What's that? You didn't catch all that? Well, Matt would like you to know that any deck list applicable to this video can be found down in the doobly-doo. And hey, let's not forget, the whole reason to participate in these totally free midweek Magic events is the prize support is awesome. You get a rare for your first and second win, and then you get a random cosmetic for your third. How awesome is that? All right, so with all that having been said, don't forget, smash the like button like Hulk would. And of course, comment and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And one last thing, myself, I'm coming to you from America, and I have noticed that about 1/3 of my viewership is coming from the US, and about 1/3 is coming from various countries. And there's about 1/3 of my viewership that is just getting lumped into other. So to let me know you got to the end of the video, throw me a comment down in there and let me know where you are watching from.